and welcome to Improbable Things. I'm J. Grace Pennington, and this is my podcast where I share 6 improbable thoughts before breakfast. So I missed last week, which I will talk a little bit more about in a minute, but I'm back and I'm ready to dive in for the day. So again, I apologize for missing last week. There were a couple reasons for this, one of which I'll talk a little more about later, but also partly my allergies have flared up yet again. And if you've been around for a while, you'll know that there were several times over the past year that my allergies made me lose my voice. And so I thought I was losing my voice last week, and thankfully my voice just got a little iffy and never quite lost it all the way. So I'm glad of that, but it did not sound quite right. So anyway, but I'm feeling much better, sounding better, and glad to be back. So I'm going to dive into these 6 things. The number 1, I did finish up the In His Image revisions and got started on the revisions for book number 3 in my series, Machiavellian. And I mentioned last time how the writing on In His Image was just very poor. Like, I'm so glad that I decided to go back through it because, yeah, I just think that's going to be very helpful for the series because it was really bad. I was really surprised, honestly, because I think I'd mentioned the writing in Ray Alloway, while not the greatest of all time. I mean, that was my first book over a decade ago. The writing in my second book, In His Image, was just really bad. Like it was just significantly worse, and I still have no idea why that was. So then I was very curious going into book 3 how it was going to go, and surprisingly the writing style, at least in my opinion, in book 3 kind of jumped back up in quality again pretty dramatically. I actually feel like some of the writing in the 3rd book is better than some of the writing I'm doing now. Like, there were still a lot of problems, and there were a lot of things like I clearly did not know how to use semicolons back then. And there's just some weird things like that. And there are some places where still I'm not fully committing by using words like slightly or almost, or things like I've talked about before. But it's much less of that, and I apparently must have really been working on or reading about or studying or something the art of showing versus telling, and of I guess just giving specific visual and sensory information to communicate things rather than just coming out and explaining them, or whatever you want to call that. Showing versus telling is the conventional wisdom. Because I do a lot of that in this book, more than I think I generally do, like I said, even in my writing now. Like, I did a lot of describing, like if someone was talking, describing what little motions and mannerisms they might be having in those moments, or describing the sounds that are going on around people just in the general ambience, which is something I always have to go back and add and fix because it doesn't come very naturally to me. But I just did a whole lot of it in this book, and it's just this weird now little tour through the history of my writing style development, I guess, because it's just a dramatic jump between books 2 and 3. And again, I mean, I wrote them right next to each other. I had the same editor on both of those, so it's just interesting. I don't know why it is, but it's taking much less work to do the editing on Machiavellian, for which I am grateful. And also, this month is longer than last month, so I have a few extra days on my deadlines for books 3 and 4. So I do feel like plot-wise, book 3 is not necessarily my best of all time, but I'm not messing with any of that. You know, that just is what it is. But with the writing styles, pretty solid. So I'm enjoying going back through all of these, and hopefully the series and all of my readers will benefit. So number 3, I believe I mentioned a while back, I've started experimenting with Amazon ads, and I did a free course on Amazon ads, I think in January. And It was very informative. I think I had tried Amazon ads sort of half-heartedly before, didn't get any clicks whatsoever, and it was just very overwhelming to try to set one up because there's all these different settings and I had no clue where to start or what they really meant or whatever. So this course really did help me with that, with just walking me through kind of what the different settings are and what different options are for how to target, an audience for an ad and things like that. So I had originally, when I was going through the course, I did all my ads for Radialloy, which worked really well in a sense because I got tons and tons of downloads, but it was very expensive and there's no profit, at least directly, on those because it's a free book. So I'm hoping that it will pay off in, further sales of the other books in the series. But I did want to try and see how it would go with one of my paid books. And I know I've mentioned before that I looked at my lifetime sales for all of my books and found that next to Radialloy, my book Never was by far my biggest seller. And so I thought, like, I should try to be pushing this one more. May even also go back at some point and kind of work on some revisions for that one because I know there's some typos and stuff in there. So anyway, I used everything I'd learned, made a few ads last month for Never, and I ended up getting like 8 clicks and 0 sales. So, I mean, the good news is it was not very expensive because I had so few clicks, but it was sort of discouraging. But one thing that was super helpful about the course that I did is that the guy that was teaching it, and his name is Brian Cohen from an organization called Best Page Forward, and he was very good in the course at really driving home, like, do not be discouraged if an ad fails or doesn't make profit or whatever. You need to see it instead as giving you information about your book that you can do something with and that you can actually use it to get information that will help you improve your sales. And so one thing he suggested is if you're not getting, clicks and you're not getting buys, it will tell you, you need to change something about your book's ad or your book sales page. So I definitely feel that I need to rewrite the ad copy, but I did a few other things. Like I changed the price. I went in and lowered the price. I added the subtitle, A Western Mystery, so that it's clear to someone just glancing at it what the genre of the book is. And one thing I decided to do was rewrite the blurb because that was one thing he suggested might need to be done. It was just to, make something that will grab the browser's eye and turn them into a buyer. And so I had already decided to work on that. And then last week, the same guy came out with a little, just like 1 session free webinar on rewriting blurbs. So I went through that, and again, it was very helpful. Some of it, and I'm really glad that I watched this because some of it I could have figured out on my own, I could see now, like the original blurb was really weak in certain areas. It didn't really give a very, it didn't give a very compelling view, I think, of the stakes and of what's actually going on in the book. Although then when I sent my updated blurb, which I thought was much better, to some friends, one of them told me that she thinks the stakes are still not clear enough, so I might be doing some more tweaking still. But another thing that he went into in this webinar is some strategies I had never really heard about or tried at all, which is after you give your synopsis that you also need to have some selling paragraphs where you really describe, kind of come out and say what the book is, like, this is this genre of book with these kinds of things in it or whatever, because people are going to be browsing your page wondering, is this book really for me? And having it spelled out in a paragraph, like what kind of book this is, they can see immediately if it's going to be the kind of book that they like without having to really do extra digging work. And then also even having a short paragraph that literally says buy the book. which felt very awkward to me. And some of the friends that I sent or showed it for feedback didn't like that part. And I'm like, I don't really like it either. It feels weird to me to write like, buy the book today or whatever. Like, it just feels weird. But that is what he said to do. And he actually even showed some statistics that show that books that have a, concluding call to action paragraph like that, even if it's that explicit, like saying buy this, actually do sell better than books that don't have it. So I decided to trust him and give it a try. So I'm going to try running some ads again and see how that goes. But it has been really good to just learn some more about the science of blurb writing. And I think I'm going to have to now go through with my other books, and because the new copy just looks so much more dynamic and feels so much stronger to me, that now all of my rest also feel very weak. So got to do something about that. So number 4, I have been continuing to do to start school with my oldest, Violet, who's 4, just a little, and we only do 2 or 3 days a week of school, and just 15 to 20 minutes, if even, but she is working on learning to read. But what's really interesting, and because I have several younger siblings and I've heard so many of them be taught how to read, I've heard so many of them do this exact thing, but it's just funny, the propensity. I think it's very common, for kids to do this. And she didn't do it at first, but the last few lessons she's been doing this more and more, where they go to sound out a word. Like, she'll go to sound out a word, but instead of sounding it out, she'll just guess what it is. And it'll be completely wrong. Like, say she's supposed to read the word ram. She sees it as an R, maybe even sees it as an A, and she's just like, rat. I'm like, no. There's no T there. Let's sound out each sound. But then, like I mentioned before, she gets so frustrated with herself. Like, don't be frustrated. This is why we're learning. This is what learning is. This is what practice is. It just means you make mistakes and you learn and you do better. That's the whole point. But she just does it so much. And I think as her confidence grew, she just kind of has this feeling like, well, I know what that word is. I don't need to do the whole sounding out process. And just goes for it. And it's just so funny because I have seen so many of my siblings do that exact same thing. And so I think that's also helpful for me. I think in many ways, having so many younger siblings has just helped me have so much perspective on little kids and their development and so many things that are fairly normal and common. So it's much easier for me to be patient with stuff like that, because I'm just like, yep, pretty much was expecting that. But we'll have to continue working on that as she goes through the book. But overall, she is doing really well, has really started being able to sound out words quickly and just retaining it all very well. So it's been very exciting. Number 5, my currently reading. So I think last time I was working through Sense and Sensibility, which I finished, and I've finished another book since then, or a couple other books actually. And I just started a book called A Jane Austen Education. And I may have mentioned that is one part of what sort of motivated me to just actually buckle down and read through Jane Austen's works, because I wanted to read this book because it was on that book girl list that I'm trying to read through. But I didn't want to read a book about all of Jane Austen's novels without having read them myself. So, and besides, I thought I should have done this by now anyway. So read through them, really enjoyed them, and so now I'm reading this book. And so I'm very immersed in Jane Austen right now. I've watched a couple of movie and miniseries adaptations in the meantime also. But I've only read one chapter. I just started it last night. But I think as a writer, it's also just very inspiring, because this book, A Jane Austen Education, was written by a man who was extremely impacted, and his whole life and way of thinking really shaped by Jane Austen's novels, which, first of all, it's interesting that it's a man, because that's not typically the core audience you think of for Jane Austen novels. But also, it's interesting because while I don't expect to be a Jane Austen, just the very idea that that our writing and our stories could have such an impact on another person and actually really change the way they think about things. The fact that stories have that power, even if my books are never going to be classics in that same way, it's just inspiring, just the very fact that storytelling can have this effect on someone, can really change their worldview and their way of life and their whole way of thinking. And because that is really my strongest desire with my writing. I want to entertain and I want to get out the stories that are in my heart and all these things, but ultimately what I want to do is affect people's hearts and, for the better, to make them think, about important things, to improve their lives, to point to Christ, and so many of these things. And just the reminders that stories really can do that, and they have so much power, is really encouraging and just inspirational to me. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the book. Number 6, I said I was going to talk a little bit more about why I didn't do a podcast last week, and this is kind of a big topic, and I hesitate when it comes to talking about these things because it feels a little, I don't know, it just feels like something that would not be interesting necessarily to people. But whenever I do have broached this topic in the past, I've had really good feedback and people that have appreciated it, so I thought I'd go for it. And that topic is just on the subject of mental health and depression and all those things. And I've shared about dealing with depression and things like that as a writer in the past. But one thing, and so just, to go back again, already I had allergies, my voice wasn't quite up to speed, and then also last week I was really going through a spell of a lot of depression and just could not quite bring myself to be motivated to get up early and do the podcast, and it felt very pointless. So I ended up just not doing it. And that whole just kind of got me thinking a lot, because the fact is I've always had a lot of depression throughout my life, and there's been times that it's definitely been a lot worse, because for a lot of reasons. I think I was probably just younger and more immature in general, and that tends to, I think, make you, I don't know, I was less strong in general in how I dealt with things. And also just as I've moved through life, I've learned more healthy coping mechanisms and things like that. But also, it was also, as I've gotten stronger in my faith, the way that I deal with these things has improved a lot. So it's definitely not as bad now in my life as it used to be, not anywhere close. However, one thing that does affect it a lot is pregnancy. What's interesting is that I feel like in our culture, at least these days, we do hear a lot and have a lot of awareness about postpartum depression, which of course I expected to deal with my other kids because I'm prone to depression, and all the tests, or I guess like little forms or whatever, said that I was likely to deal with it, and then I really did not. But all 4 pregnancies I have dealt with prenatal depression pretty badly, and that, while it's fairly common, I feel like is much less discussed. And so it's just, there's so many hormones, so much going on in your body. It makes total sense that it would just mess with your mental health a little bit as well. So the good thing is that, like I said, as I've grown just over my life, one thing that I have grown in and been able to develop through the help of many different things, through my faith, through counseling, through books that I've read, lots, and just knowing myself better, all these things, I have learned to cope in a healthy way. I've learned tools that I can use to help me kind of ride out the waves as they come. And that's very helpful, but it still is just difficult, and it's still hard to go through. And what happens when I feel depressed is that it feels like nothing really matters. And that, of course, makes it hard to be motivated to do much of anything. And it's much harder with something like my writing, where there is really no external factor forcing me to do it. Like, for instance, I might not feel like doing the dishes or cooking or whatever, but I have to because we have to eat and we have to have clean dishes. So it's not, I might be kind of draggy doing it, but it's not that hard to summon up the motivation for those kinds of things. But then when it comes to my writing, I have no boss. I have no really, like I said, external forces that are pressing me to get any of this done. It's all things that I have decided myself that I want to do. And it's all just sort of on my own free time. And already my free time is very limited. So I have to be very on top of it if I want to get writing done and accomplish these goals. And that just becomes so much harder. Like one thing I thought of as I was preparing this morning for the podcast is like, I think normally my writing and publishing and all of that is like as if I was pushing something heavy over, like if I was pushing a heavy rock over a flat plane. And then when you add depression into the mix, it becomes like pushing it uphill. Like it's just very difficult to make myself do it. So what I've found, the only way that I can continue to stay on track with, big goals that I have, despite those waves that I have no predicting when they'll come or how long they'll last, is to have some kind of motivation that runs deeper than how I feel about it. Because how I feel in those times, and honestly, I'll feel this way sometimes even when I'm not depressed. Like, this doesn't matter. My writing is not good. I don't have that many readers. I'm not making that much money. Nobody making me do this. There's no reason for it, whatever, like these thoughts that come. I have to have something bigger than just my feelings about it to keep me going, or I would just give up very frequently, which is what I've done in the past. So often in the past, I would start stories and not finish them because then I wouldn't feel like it, or I would never do marketing, or I would make a half-hearted effort and then stop because I didn't feel like it and there's nothing making me do it. But this kind of ties into the last thing that I talked about with what our stories can do in the world and my motivation for writing in general and wanting to change hearts. I have to focus in these times, especially, and really come back to the core of why I do this. And I have to remember that I truly feel that my writing and publishing is a calling from the Lord, and these are talents that He has given me to do good work with and to bless others and to encourage others and to inspire others and to change the way people think about things. And so that is something that is important to me, whether I feel like doing something or not. And so I really have to, and actually sometimes these spells where I don't feel like doing anything can drive me back to what is the reason I'm doing this in the first place, because it forces me to look at, why is this important? Do I even need to do this? Does it even matter? Whatever. I'm reminded of the really core reasons that always exist, whether I feel like doing something or not. And I think, again, this is something that is a microcosm of all of life, because we have to have those underlying foundations for everything in life, because our feelings always do change, whether you wrestle with depression or something else, or no matter who you are, we all have feelings that change about things that go on in our lives. But we need to have these underlying principles and just core, really root things that hold us to what's important in our lives. And one thing I think that I've really learned about myself the last few years, and I was actually just talking about this with my grandmother the other day, is that I've learned that I am very internally motivated. I think more than a lot of people that I know. I really don't require a lot of external motivation. Like if I am going to go on a diet and lose weight, I'm pretty good about sticking to it without external accountability or a lot of those things that are generally recommended.